Everybody, I'm Eli Lake of Newsweek Magazine and the Daily Beast, and I'm joined here today with Michelle Shephard, Senior National Security Correspondent for the Toronto Star and the author of, and I'm holding it up here, the new book, Decade of Fear, which is like the kind of insider, unredacted reporter notebook of one of the best sort of reporters of the war on terrorism and her journeys and travels in the last 10 years. Thanks for coming on Blogging Heads, Michelle.
Hi, Eli. It's good to be here.
Cool. So let's jump into it. So let me start off. Why did you title the book Decade of Fear?
Well, it feels like for the last 10 years, fear has really driven much of what has happened. A lot of our foreign policies have been driven by fear. We've had sort of knee-jerk reactions when we've had incidents that have obviously made us fearful. And really, it's how I started, too, because I started this on 9/11. I was a crime reporter at the time, didn't know a lot about it. And I remember those days in New York after 9/11 and how fearful it was then.
Tell me a little bit what you mean. How are you kind of using? I mean, we've heard this concept of the politics of fear before, and before we kind of get into the substance of it, I'd like to spend a little bit just fleshing you out. Like, what do you mean by the politics of fear? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think obviously, and you know this because you cover the same area, national security issues are so complicated. They really are. And they take a nuanced approach to try and combat terrorism. And I think, unfortunately, what we've had happen over the last 10 years is that it's just been rhetoric, really, that has driven what we've done in other countries. And I've definitely seen that in terms of, stories that I've done in Guantanamo. I saw that quite tragically in Somalia and as well as Yemen. So I think it's just that I think we're getting out of this era, but I think for so long it was just the fear that 9/11 gave us that just we would have really knee-jerk reactions to so many things, whereas we needed to sort of take a breath, get away from the incident that was driving the policy and think about what the best way to go forward was.
Okay, so you think that to a degree, and I'd like to kind of return to that,
Sure.
but I think I want to push back a little bit on the concept of the politics of fear, because I think in some cases that term is used to say that there is an irrationality behind the warnings of top government people.
Right.
And at least I think that, there was, especially after 9/11, but you could point to up to 9/11, there was a group called Al-Qaeda. They made it clear what their means and methods were. They made it clear what their ends were. And they made it clear that they were at war with the United States and that this is what they wanted to do. Right. And they also, the other part of that, which I think is the side that's rarely discussed, because we tend to speak about 9/11 in the context of, Islamic fundamentalism, or in the context of radical Islam and Al-Qaeda as an Islamic phenomenon. But there's also this other phenomenon, which is small groups of dedicated individuals can can create mass casualty events, can kill lots of people, by kind of using modern technology, whether it be airplanes or cyber attacks or something like that, in a way kind of against the population. So I think that those two things, I don't know that I would say that they were irrational, that the government should have prepared to try to prevent those things. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think part of the other title, the rest of the title for the book, Reporting from Terrorism's Gray Zone, is what I was trying to get at. And we talk about politics of fear on one end, but there's completely the other spectrum where I think people aren't taking the risk seriously as well. So really, it's just been these very black and white stories, and that's what I'm trying to play off of with this gray zone, when it's not like that. So I mean, half the stories I've done have been writing about the horrors of these groups, Al-Qaeda, what we call Al-Qaeda Central, or what old Al-Qaeda is, but also what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Somalia, what happened in Pakistan. I mean, there's no doubt that there is a risk. There's no doubt that it continues and that these groups need to be managed in some way. It's just, unfortunately, I think a lot of the ways that we've gone at it has only made it more of a problem. And that's something I try and get at in the book that I hope runs through the book.
And I want to definitely get on that, but I just want to say one more thing about the politics of fear. Fear is a powerful, useful, and exploitable political emotion that's used by all sides, I think. In this country, for years, the Democratic Party would play on the fear of senior citizens that if you elected Republicans, they would cut Social Security and Medicare, and you would be forced to survive on cat food. Other kinds of politics of fear that if you elect that there is a secretive cabal of policy intellectuals that are responsible for subverting the democratic process and getting us into an unnecessary war. That fear is a constant, I think, in modern politics, and that it's something that I think in some ways is a legitimate place, which is that, or at least forget legitimate, I just think it's something that's sort of done, and it's not just limited, I think, to what appears now as clearly a bipartisan consensus for a very large, intrusive, and powerful counterterrorism kind of permanent state.
Mm-hmm. I don't disagree that fear can be used effectively, I guess. It's
often used effectively. I mean, I think, I feel like everybody kind of uses fear in politics.
Sure. And I'm not, I'm not talking only about the political spectrum, however, though. I'm talking about other issues, business issues, things such as, here's a ridiculous example, but I remember after the so-called underwear bomber, and I was flying on vacation from Toronto to, I can't remember where it was, anyway, Belize, but I was going through the States, and so here I am at Toronto Airport. I get pulled aside, and we've got this fancy new equipment, and I'm forced to take my hands and put them in my pockets and rigorously rub my hands out, hold them up for this explosives test. That's just a ridiculous policy. And we could have a whole conversation about airport security. That's
sure about airport. Yeah.
That's something different. But there's an example of something. How much money is spent, how much manpower is spent on this. That really is an absolute knee-jerk reaction because we almost had this devastating case. And I would just argue that money and that attention would be better spent elsewhere. That's just one specific example. But that's sort of more what I'm getting at in terms of...
No, but now let's dive into something, because we've had our little prelude about fear. But let's talk about what do you think are the key overreactions, the knee-jerk reactions that followed the September 11 attacks?
Well, I guess, I think there's been quite a few, but I think the one that I probably am most familiar with was in Somalia. And in 2006, I went to Mogadishu because there was talk of what was being dubbed the African Taliban. This group, the Islamic Courts Union, had taken power. And, I was, as always, I'm very cautious when I'm in Mogadishu. I had no idea what this group was doing. Everything I read sounded like it was, Al-Qaeda's next proxy. And but I've been hearing from a lot of Somali contacts saying, no, you got to come. Mogadishu is really different. So when I got there, what I saw, and I was really lucky, I managed to interview the leadership of the ICU, all four sort of leaders there. And what I saw is that they'd actually brought some sense of stability to Mogadishu. Somalis were delighted. They weren't exactly, they were nervous about some of their practices, but they were delighted to have safety. It was really that basic there. But this rhetoric about, Africa's Taliban, look what happened when we didn't handle the Taliban in Afghanistan, and that gave rise to Al-Qaeda. We have to go after this now. Fast forward 2 years later, a devastating war with Ethiopia with the backing of U.S. and other players. And what it gave rise to was exactly what we were fearful of, which is the Shabab, which is one of the greatest risks today. And just to sort of underscore that point.
Do you distinguish between the Islamic... You don't think that there was elements of the Shabab in at least the military arm of the ICU in 2005 and 2006?
There absolutely was.
A lot of the players are the same, aren't they?
There absolutely was. There was a militant wing of the ICU that was very troubling, very worrying. Yeah. But the head of the ICU was the guy who is now President Sharif. So obviously there were moderate members within that group. I mean, one of the leaders that I interviewed at that time was Hassan Tahir Awais, who is actually now one of the leaders of the Shabab. At that time, anyway, he was considered one of more of the moderate voices. And I think that's the thing that, people didn't understand about Somalia is Somalia is not Afghanistan. And the lure of the ICU and then the Shabab even is not the same as what you saw in the Taliban. Anyway, I mean, the overriding point is that it was misunderstood. And we had a devastating war that gave rise to the Shabab. So there was a case where I feel it was. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it and say everything's fear, 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 but it was just a case of not understanding what was going on the ground.
Well, I've never been to Mogadishu, so in some ways I have to defer to you, though I have covered that, and I would just let me push back on a couple of things there.
Sure.
Okay, so point one, that we know that plotters of the 98 embassy bombings were a major part of at least the military leadership at the time of the ICU in 2006. So this element, the wing of, I guess we could call them Al-Shabaab 1.0. And that they according to at least my understanding, they were unrepentant. So they were not reformed of their views of the late 1990s.
Correct.
Number two, there are certainly many criticisms legitimate criticisms of the transitional federal government, but it was the recognized kind of caretaker body of Somalia, and they were challenged by the ICU, and, in some ways you could argue that should count for something, which is to say the international community recognizes a transitional federal government of Somalia, and what does it say about the international community if it doesn't defend that from the onslaught of the Islamic Courts Union? And then finally, I would make a point about number three, which is that I don't doubt that stability was appreciated by Somalis, especially given the terrible kind of, history of really a lack of government and civil wars within Somalia. But the agenda of the Islamic Courts Union was one that I don't think you could say was to impose a kind of stricter version of Islamic law on society. I remember stories at the time reported from the ground about how the Islamic Courts Union were doing the kinds of things of rounding up, DVDs and basically trying to enforce as they saw Islamic law, and that there were certainly pockets of the population, more than pockets, there were quite a few people who did not like that. Would you dissent on those points?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. That's what I meant in the saying that Somalis weren't supportive of their ideology. I mean, in Somalia, women are incredibly powerful.
Right.
People love to watch soccer. They love to chew khat. Music's a big part. So there were those issues. Absolutely. And I'm not saying that there weren't elements that were extremely worrying. But starting a war with an arch rival of Somalia, the people who watched Somalia warned that this was perhaps, the worst idea possible.
So you're saying not worth, but we should say by way of background that the Ethiopians clearly invaded Somalia at the behest of and urging of and with cooperation, not just intelligence, but probably special forces elements of U.S. AFRICOM as it was being first stood up.
Right, and Ethiopia is a longtime ally of Somalia, and people who know Somalia know that it's as the famous Black Hawk Down incident, among others, showed, it's a fiercely nationalistic country. And so, what happened was there wasn't a lot of support for the ICU's doctrine. There was support for what they managed to do, which was, control the warlords and the corrupt leaders of the TFG that weren't popular either. So there wasn't that support. But they were happy for the stability, and I think there was a real opportunity there to negotiate with many of the moderate leaders who are now the internationally backed leaders. And
who've joined the TFG.
and join or reform the TFG or something that didn't involve, tanks rolling across the border. Because then what happened is, and I know people who are here in the Somali community actually, who don't support the Shabab, but left Toronto. You had many leave Washington, all over the States, all over the world. Many from the Somali diaspora actually left here, went back to Somalia to join what became the Shabab to fight Ethiopian forces. When Ethiopia was forced to withdraw in 2009, they came back home. They didn't support this, global war that the Shabab is now fighting in connection with Al Qaeda. They were supporting their homeland. So it was just seen as a completely different war.
Well, I've read some of the court cases in this country about the Shabab recruitment in Minneapolis.
Right.
And that at least looks like an operation that, gives a young Somali American the opportunity to join what they had described, at least according to the FBI's case, as a global Islamic struggle.
Right.
That does not mean that there weren't people who were motivated by a sense of honor for defending their homeland against Ethiopia.
Right.
And by the way, they could be both, right? But
sure.
It seems that the operation was. And it was conducted through what I guess you would call our radical mosques. This was done through Islamic kind of infrastructure to bring the fighters from the United States and I guess Canada. I don't know. I know less about Canada than I do about the U.S. cases.
We have cases as well. Yeah, we have 6 cases here. Not as many as the U.S., but we have them, or 6 that we know of. There's probably others. But yeah, and that's continuing today. Yeah. I mean, that actually is one of the stories. I'm sure you've tried to get at this the same way I have. It drives me crazy because here are these kids given every opportunity possible, and they get, usually seduced online to go off. And I mean, they become this cannon fodder when they get to Mogadishu. Most of them haven't been there before, and it's a tragedy that's happening. But I mean, that is different. And there were some of those kids who did that during Ethiopia, sure, and some who stayed, some who didn't come back. Absolutely. But I think, the problem is we talk about the Shabab as one organization, one period of time, and it's not. I mean, there were the elements of the Shabab in 2006 when the ICU was in control. There was the Shabab in 2007, 2008, and there's the Shabab with what we're dealing with now. And, I just argue that had we handled the situation differently in 2006, I believe it would not be the problem that it is today. And it's really worrying now.
Can I? Why do you? So you think that you could have made a deal with the more moderate side of the ICU that would have then turned on the radical elements in their military wing? Is that what you're saying?
I am, and you know what? People a lot smarter than me are saying that. I mean, people who follow Somalia full time.
I'm familiar with it. I've been a bit skeptical of it in the sense that. I just, and I have to, again, I haven't been to Mogadishu, so I want to, just kind of caveat that. So I'm deferring a lot to what you're saying, and you were there, and if people were saying that they brought stability and that they had legitimacy, then I obviously take that seriously. But my concern was that almost always, whenever you have a situation where you have kind of more moderate side mixed in with, fanatics, and more radical side, it almost always takes a violent confrontation, whether that's on bar or we can show in the other examples when, there were committed communists versus social democrats after World War II in Eastern Europe, and we saw what happened there. And I just feel that you always have to be wary that, there is an advantage if other powers walk away and it's a contest between kind of moderate, pragmatic types and then the more extreme types.
But again, I don't think it has, that's going back to this black and white issue. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it can be both. I think, unfortunately, then it was just a disastrous military policy, and that was the focus. But I'm not saying that, some
But you think the military policy also ended up radicalizing in some ways, kind of making a cause celeb.
Absolutely.
Creating a recruitment tool, if you will, for the ranks of the more radical side of the ICU and the Al-Shabaab.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, there's some people there, some people who are in power now, and you're not going to negotiate with them. I mean, one of this is sort of starts and ends the book, but one of the most touching stories, one of the most important stories that I've done over the last few years is about this amazing teenager I met in Mogadishu last year, and he had refused to join the Shabab. And that's a really brave thing to do in Mogadishu. And I think that's
absolutely.
why, I think that's why it's important for people who are making these policies to really be there and understand that, sometimes we look at this with understandably sort of Western eyes, and how could you join this group that does this? Well, you're 18 years old, you've grown up with nothing but war, you have nothing. And this group comes in and says, I'll give you a cell phone, and I'll give you a gun, I'll give you a wage, which the government wasn't doing for its soldiers. And by the way, if you don't join, I'm going to kill your mom and dad. So anyway, this kid had said, no, I want to stay in school, I don't want to join the Shabab. And they had taken him to a stadium, and they'd cut off his hand, and then they cut off his foot.
Right.
And anyway, this was a kid that I ended up keeping in touch with, and he got refugee status in Harstad, Norway, if you can believe. So I flew with him 200 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, where he now lives. But that's a long story.
Wow.
But
that's an amazing story. And this book is I haven't read the whole thing, but I've kind of flipped through, and it's chock full of these great anecdotes like that.
Thanks.
But if I could, I'd like to get to one of the opening anecdote, which is extraordinary. But how did you get on a CIA cruise with Mike Hayden and Porter Goss? How did Michelle Shephard get on that junket?
Well, I mean, one of my fascinations over the years has been, what we call this like terrorism theater of the absurd, because again, you must have this, like sometimes you do these interviews and you can't believe things are happening or people have said this. So it was one of those assignments that actually a friend of mine at work saw an email for a spy cruise, and sort of sent it on to me saying, hey, maybe you want to go on this. And I can't remember how I convinced my editor that it was something I should go on. But I just applied. There were actually two other journalists. There were just the three of us there. And it is actually, they have these cruises where it's a regular cruise. It's the first one I'd ever been on. And 200 of the passengers actually are taking part of the spy cruise. And we had, our own little badges and whatever. And during the day, you would sit in this room where these officials, including Michael Hayden and Porter Goss and others, would give lectures.
But Michael Hayden and Porter Goss are two former directors of the CIA.
Former CIA, right? And
former CIA directors. Yeah.
And so, I as a Canadian, I don't cover Washington. I mean, I'm there sometimes, but it's not my beat. I don't have access to these guys very often. But more than anything, I thought, well, I'll be trapped on a boat. Like, what great access you can have. So it was fascinating. And and so I opened the book with a scene where they agreed to take some questions in the Silk Den, which was the 11th floor bar of the cruise. And Porter Goss was using bar nuts to describe the waterboarding of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is the
I love that story. I love that story. I mean, why don't you? Do you want to just tell us tell us the story again, or I could find it in the book and read it. But why don't you say it? I mean,
sure.
It's great.
Okay, I'll say it. So one of the issues that for me have been covering Guantanamo and enhanced interrogation tactics, and so I'd always been interested in the issue of these tactics and waterboarding and whether this actually worked, and so we were challenging Goss on the premise that one, this tactic actually got actionable intelligence, that it actually worked, and two, which is something I've heard a lot of intelligence people in the intelligence field tell me, is that they don't believe it works, people I've talked to. And also they've said, even if it does work, they appreciate that it has created this negative impression that has been more harmful. Anyway, there's a great debate about that, people on either side. So we were asking Porter Goss, and he was, they're very candid with us, but he was getting, I think, perturbed by the persistent questioning. So he was downplaying what waterboarding is, because I said, you still support this. The president now calls it torture, and he doesn't believe it's torture. So he sort of, as an example, he picked up the bar nuts and he said, what do you know what 183 is, which is the number of times that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed,
right,
allegedly Al-Qaeda's number 3, went through waterboarding. And so he was sort of trying to show it was actually quite benign, and he was using the bar nuts to sort of drop out a cashew and then an almond and counting 1, 2. I think we only got to 3, but anyway, it was kind of surreal. It was really one of those moments that you think, wow, I'm on this cruise ship over the Atlantic, and we're using bar nuts to talk about waterboarding.
It's one of those. It's one of the things that makes the book so readable and so interesting, because there are these. It's very human. It's like you're oftentimes you probably read about that topic, and it's in the kind of dry prose of a newspaper article, and the quotes of a committee hearing or something. But this is it's delightful to kind of read it in the this human side.
Oh, thank you.
Do you want to take a second and kind of like?
Sorry, I was just going to say. I mean, thank you for that. But I do get frustrated too, and again, because we're on the same beat, you must find this as well, because so much of it's fascinating, but you do know that it can be overwhelming, and we can get very inside baseball in describing these
Sure.
stories, and so try and make it readable if I can. But anyway, sorry, I interrupted.
Well, like we all try to make it readable. I mean, that's why we're the pros as opposed to just interested parties. But You're right. Why don't we talk a little bit about the substance of it? I think it's pretty clear kind of how you view this. But I want to kind of hear you spell out the argument about waterboarding and, do you count that as one of the knee-jerk kind of decade of fear policies that,
it's. I did put myself in the book, and mainly through I needed a vehicle, so I try and look at it as, here I am, a 29-year-old crime reporter on 9/11, don't know much about terrorism, and so I'm going to spend 10 years trying to figure it out, and you come along. But what I really try not to do is sort of tell people what I think about issues, and in terms of, I mean, I think it comes through in the writing, but I want
I'm the
people
same way. I know what you mean. I can try to.
You just want people to figure it out.
Report what I think. It's important for what I uncover in my reporting. Right.
Right. So here's what people say about waterboarding. Ali Soufan just came out with his book, and he says emphatically that it didn't work. Others say that it did. The debate continues. Fact is, it doesn't get used anymore now. So, I mean, what I really kind of, I'm not trying to back out of the question, but what I'm really trying to do in the book is, I'm going to tell you all my experiences. I'm going to tell you about all these characters. So I'm going to tell you about, Ismail Khalif Abdul, who had his hand cut off. I'm going to also tell you about, Sheikh Dahir Awais, who was, who agreed to an interview. And I'm just going to tell you about all these characters and these places. I'm going to tell you what it's like to be in Gitmo 23 times. And then, you draw your own conclusions. So it's sort of, when I'd like to actually ask you by the end of the book, what you take away with it. And I don't think actually everybody's going to take away the same thing. But I do think that, what I hopefully do and what we all do in our reporting is, really point out the mistakes that were made in the last decade, so that we're not making them again. And and that's the most depressing thing, that history does repeat itself. And back to the issue of Somalia, I'm not sure. I just got back from Mogadishu a couple of weeks ago, mainly reporting on the famine. But we've got Ethiopian troops going back in. There's a war going on with Shabab now in the south, and actually, after we get off the phone here, I have to finish the story on that because, I'm not sure. There's certain aspects that I feel like history is repeating itself again. So.
Okay, well, I have reported a lot on the interrogation question, and, what I would say is, I think you would agree that after 9/11, there was a panic in the sense that they felt that, I think at all levels of the U.S. government, there was a sense that there was inadequate information on this organization, Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
And so they began kind of thinking, okay, we're at war.
Right.
we're going to capture people. When we capture them, what are we going to do? And they said, okay, well, we're going to interrogate them because we need to find out more about this organization that's at war with us all over the world. And I think from that, they then began coming up with the rules that ultimately became known as enhanced interrogation techniques. And you started to see people making decisions like Addington and you and others being ignored, as we know from Jane Mayer's, about what was and what wasn't legal under the U.S. law that prohibits torture. And the initial definition of what would be allowed by U.S. personnel in interrogation was scaled back by Jack Goldsmith in 2005, I think, when he went to the Justice Department. And so the Bush administration itself had reversed some of the initial legal findings on this.
Right.
So that's the first thing. And I think that's an accurate rendering of what happened. Then there's the question of whether it was effective. Of course, the argument is people will say anything to stop torture. So if you were being drowned and waterboarded, you would say anything to get people to stop that. I think that is not what is intended from the perspective of people who have said sometimes these techniques work. What they say is that you don't expect to get the correct or the true answer after you waterboard somebody, but the idea is to establish penalties or sanctions for somebody so they know that if they are dishonest with you or they hold back, they will face things that are horrible and unpleasant and terrible, like waterboarding. So that's one reason, I guess, why they say they should do it. And then the other is that, and this is the terrible truth about this line of, which is that when you do these kinds of harsh techniques, in some cases the intent is to break the will of the person you're interrogating so that they have no longer the will to deceive you. So you've broken them as a person, essentially.
Right. And those are legitimate. Those are legitimate techniques.
And I want to say that that's a gruesome context to think that our government would be engaged in that. And I think an even worse, an even more scary idea would be that if a government is doing that, if the military or the CIA would be engaged in the science, if you will, the practice of trying to break people like that, then that would mean they probably have a division that would do research and research and development into new techniques in terms of breaking people.
Right.
And that is a kind of horrific idea, that you would have government secret research into ways to break people, destroy people's wills. So I think for all those reasons and more, that the U.S. kind of quickly reversed that tack.
Right.
Because even if it did work, but I think that in some cases you could argue, at least assuming that the CIA Inspector General report and other things that were released under Obama were correct, after this, what's 185 times KSM was waterboarded?
183, yeah.
183.
Yeah.
Well, apparently he taught a course to the CIA in the history of Al-Qaeda, which was helpful. So again,
I think though when you're talking about the interrogation techniques, if you look, you can, and this stuff is publicly available. I think it's the Army Field Manual. There's various places that talk about different tactics for interrogations, fear up, fear down. I mean, everybody knows the good cop, bad cop, but there actually are. I mean, I don't think anybody who's criticizing the policies that came after are saying that you need to cuddle the terrorists to get them to talk. But I think, and for me, a lot of what I've read and I've talked with Ali Soufan, who was involved in a lot of these techniques. A lot of what he was saying made sense in terms of the way that they would get information. And it wasn't necessarily by the harshest technique, but there were psychological tricks that were played. And then, as you said, it gets into questions of laws. How far does it go? And what we found is that obviously it went too far. And I think again, this is a bit cliche, but you do lose as the nation that sort of moral high ground when you employ those techniques. And I think that, and people disagree on this, but I really believe in fighting Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, that narrative becomes really important. And Al-Qaeda's been very good at the propaganda and spreading their narrative. So the counter-narrative has to be one, that doesn't include losing this moral high ground with things like waterboarding.
Well, if I may,
Yeah.
just I'm a little bit. I'm not pushing back so much. I mean, we're discussing here.
No, feel free. It's good.
I don't have settled thoughts. I mean, I'm conflicted on this, and one of the things I like about being a reporter is I don't need to come up with a neat conclusion on these things.
That's right.
But I mean, I would just say a couple things. I think that for the hardened Al-Qaeda types,
Right.
as an ideology, they will find any pretext to be at war with America.
Right.
Insofar as the images of Abu Ghraib, which was an absolute killer for the United States in so many levels, which, by the way, wasn't the EIT program. I don't think the two things are connected. But Abu Ghraib, which was a unit and a problem with the detention facilities in Iraq, and it was the military as opposed to the CIA, and
Right.
on and on. Those images that came out were very powerful in terms of convincing the kind of Muslims who don't want to join in the revolution to sit on their hands and not help the local government, or
Right.
in the case of Iraq, the U.S. military, or in the case of Afghanistan, the U.S. military, in rounding up and giving the crucial intelligence to find the hardened Al-Qaeda types.
Right, and you're absolutely correct that there's going to be, no matter what. I mean, these guys are masters at propaganda. They'll always find tools, but there certainly have been.
They'll
some
always
real
find
gifts.
some. They'll find some. Yeah, they will always find some pretext.
Sure.
They always do. And then, I mean, the second thing though that I would just point out is that I last week I interviewed before Thanksgiving a retired, very senior military general on a series of things. Anyway, but one of the things this person told me was that torture did not work and was bad because it demoralizes the units that have to do it, which is to say that people know it's evil. So
Right.
if you're asked to do it, if you're asked to waterboard people, that has this very corrosive effect on your own CIA, on your own military. And that, I think, is an interesting perspective. It's an argument that you don't hear as much.
I think I'm glad you raised it, because I think that's actually one of the points I was going to make about when we talked about, I mean, we often talk about the enhanced interrogation techniques, but when you talk about sort of the general mindset after 9/11 that was getting intelligence at all costs. I've interviewed a lot of soldiers who were at Bagram, and one in particular who, his name's Damien Corsetti, and he's come up in Guantanamo as a witness. And he was the one, you might actually recall his case, because he was sort of famous at one point because he was accused of allegations, and he has the word monster tattooed across his chest, and he was accused of doing horrendous things to the detainees in Bagram. And he's completely messed up now. He suffers from PTSD, and he suffers because of what he did. And he said that it was in Bagram. They were in Bagram, 8 months after 9/11. They'd lost buddies. They had other buddies fighting war they were losing, and they were told, these are the terrorists here. And I think that has really damaged, as you say, not just the psyche of a country, but the psyche of these individuals as well.
Yeah,
if that's what you were saying, if I understood correctly.
I think there's quite a few military, there's quite a few military officers and soldiers and CIA officers who know who believe very firmly that they are on the side of morality and civilization, and that they're fighting an enemy that would seek to destroy those things. But I guess I want to kind of bring it up to the present, right? President Obama pretty much got the United States out of the interrogation business overseas, at least. The FBI handles it for the domestic threats, and they try to make, court cases. But when someone is captured overseas, they are usually handled by partner security services, and this is a very murky area, but I mean, I just raised the question, do you think that those people who were captured in 2009, 2010, and 2011 are facing any kind of humane treatment, when, the Kenyan or the Somali TFG or the Yemeni or the Pakistani ISI interrogates them?
Oh no, I'm sure the standards in those countries. I mean, it's well documented that they're rampant human rights abuses. But I would actually disagree that we're out of the. And I say we, even though I'm Canadian, but I mean Canada by proxy is involved in much of what the U.S. is. But I would disagree that the U.S. is out of the intelligence business abroad.
Not intelligence, and interrogation.
Sorry, the interrogation business abroad.
There are a couple cases like that. Warsami guy who was captured and interrogated on the naval brig in the Indian Ocean. And
but in Mogadishu, I mean, I just came. I couldn't believe. Flying into Mogadishu, there's this massive. They call it the Pink House, right beside the airport. It's a massive, not so secret, CIA facility that's there. And I think.
Well, but is the CIA doing the interrogations, or is it somebody? Is it the partner service that they're trying to stand up?
We don't really know. I mean, they're working in conjunction with the Somali intelligence. I'm not necessarily saying that's a good or a bad thing. It's just I think that there is a presence. I think the game's changed, but I think.
Oh no, I agree that there's definitely a presence. I'm just saying that the idea that there were CIA.
The black sites. Yeah.
There was a place called Guantanamo. It still is open, but we don't send anybody new there. Brennan has made very clear that nobody new is going to be sent there.
Right.
Bagram was a place that would receive people. There are no U.S. facilities that receive people who are captured overseas in the global war on terrorism. There are probably foreign prisons that receive people, and I'm sure that there are times when U.S. interrogators are in the room and asking questions, but they are in the, I guess you could say, the custody of partner security service. That's my point.
Right, they are. And does
an
that
American prison?
Right, and does that mean that treatment is worse? Does that mean that we're not getting the same intelligence? I think
I don't know.
I don't know either.
Definitively.
Yeah.
No. I have my suspicions. I mention it because I think that Obama, very much sympathetic to the Ali Safan, Michelle Shephard view that this was a huge, panicked overreaction. It was contrary to our values. We should get out of that.
Right.
And so he did. And he said he wanted to close the Guantanamo. But it has created this other problem, which is that if you capture somebody, and there are operations all over the world, as we both know, being done by U.S. Special Operations Forces and the CIA and partners and so forth and so on, that when people are captured, where do you put them? And we don't know.
Right. Well, I mean,
Well, we do know. It's, ghost prisons of the, Ethiopian military or security services. That's where they go. They do not go to Bagram or U.S. The 5 U.S. prisons in and around Baghdad. They don't go to those places anymore.
I mean, I think the what would be great to see more and more is those people going to trial. I mean, I know that's easy to say and hard to do, but I mean, I think that was the intention when. Take Guantanamo for an instance, when he, day 2 signed the executive order to shut Guantanamo. That was the idea, and I think that's just been a disaster since the beginning in terms of what's happened with that.
Well, let's wrap it up with your Yemen chapter.
Sure.
I loved that chapter because you really did. I think you really did a great job of kind of capturing this very ancient, old city where, lots of kind of mid-level retired Al-Qaeda guys live out in the open. But why don't you sort of talk about this dilemma of why Obama decided not to return all these Yemeni detainees at Guantanamo to Yemen?
Well, the Yemen detainees are the problem detainees, really, because they make up a majority of the remaining population in Gitmo, and they were the ones that the administration, many of whom had cleared for release but don't want to return them to Yemen, some they believe are dangerous, but they don't have the evidence, or they don't have untainted evidence that they can use to try them. So I guess I was there in 2009 doing that story, but this was pre the Fort Hood shooting, pre the underwear bomber, and so Yemen sort of wasn't really on the map as much then. And you know, it was a difficult question. What do you do? Because the country was not stable, and there was an Al-Qaeda presence in Yemen, AQAP, which is, you know, now one of the big franchise groups, if you call them that. So the question I was trying to look at was, you know, what do you do? Can you return these guys? And what I found then, and it's changed in the trips I've been back since, but what I found then was unbelievable support for the Obama administration, just support for the U.S., and that's really quite unprecedented in Yemen. But general public support, it was, you know, just a few years or a few months rather after his inauguration, and people there really believed that the detainees were going to come back, and so the question was, you know, for what I was trying to get at is, what is the risk greater for those detainees to come back who might, you know, then join AQAP, or for the people around those detainees who were, some of whom were getting radicalized because these detainees were being held indefinitely. I mean, that really, Guantanamo, despite what people say, because I hear this debated a lot, Guantanamo does impact. I mean, everywhere I've been in the world, you know, from Djibouti to Pakistan to I don't know where else, to parts of Canada. But people do look at that Guantanamo as a stain and hypocrisy. I mean, that's just the way, whether you think it is or not, that's just the perception that's out there among other countries. So that was the big question: what happens with the Yemeni detainees? And at that time, I'd been talking to people in state who had been saying that they were looking at ways to, you know, return the detainees, that it wasn't going to be a ban. And then the Fort Hood shooting happened, and then we had the underwear bomber, and then AQAP was very much on the radar, Anwar al-Awlaki was very much on the radar, and it was right after that Obama said none of the detainees will go back to Yemen.
Well, I mean, there's another good reason not to send detainees back to Yemen. There have been some pretty high-profile Al-Qaeda-related jailbreaks in Yemen.
It's not a simple... Yemen is not a simple...
I mean, I'm just saying it's
yeah.
not clear that Yemen can hold people who are sent to their jails.
Yemen is so complicated, and I, you know, in all the story, they're really hard stories to write because I don't want to oversimplify them. In maybe a way, I probably just did summing it up there, but because it is a tricky country, and you know, I think a lot of that this year, I was there for a month at the start of the revolution there, and it really helped me learn a lot, and I think it's helped other people learn a lot about Yemen too, because a lot of the problem was with, you know, our ally, President Saleh, who I think played both sides of that. So sure, there were problems with returning detainees. Yeah. And now poor Yemen is, you know, just if it was bad before, if it was bad when I was there in March, it's really tragic right now. It's really on the brink. So.
Well, I mean, there were people, as we both know, and you document, that were sent to Guantanamo who were innocent and who were just the product of just terrible intelligence that first year or two of the war, where, you know, we paid people, you know, local chieftains to tell us who was an Al-Qaeda person, and so they clearly took advantage of us to have us eliminate some of their local rivals. But that said, Guantanamo also became a place for hardened, you know, suspected terrorists in what I would say both Obama and Bush, though Obama doesn't call it this, are waging in a war all over the world against terrorists. And those people are dangerous, and you don't want them. You want them to remain detained without escaping and wreaking more havoc. And my sense of it was that almost everybody kind of looked at the situation in Yemen. They couldn't credibly say that these people would stay in jail.
Right. I mean, they couldn't. And
I think that was before the Fort Hood.
Right. I think though what happened was that that ended any discussion. I mean, I think there was a nuanced discussion that was going on.
I think there were people in the administration who were still pushing for it nonetheless. And I think that after Ford had those voices were drowned out.
Right. And I'm not saying, I mean, it was a complicated problem, and Guantanamo overall remains a complicated problem. Now we're down to, I think it's 171, and, still under Obama, how many trials have we had? So, those cases are just going to go on and on and on. But there are still people there who have been cleared for release and don't have anywhere to be settled. So there really are still, there's some hard cases there, absolutely. People that I hope go to trial, and I think they're going to be pretty easy trials. Some of them. I know every time I've gone to, not saying that this will be an easy trial, but every time I've seen Khalid Sheikh Mohammed at Guantanamo, he's pretty much pleaded guilty. But there are some cases there still that are sympathetic, people that the Pentagon has cleared for release, and they're stuck there.
Well, let me end on a provocative note.
Has this not been provocative so far?
No, it's very. I think it has been provocative. But let me end on a. If the U.S. is out of the enhanced interrogation business and is adhering by the Army Field Manual, if now the Supreme Court has instructed Congress to rewrite rules for military tribunals and Congress has approved and the Obama administration has gone along grudgingly, leaving aside, of course, that Guantanamo remains, I don't doubt, a potent symbol for many in the world of American perfidy and malignance. But given all of that, do you think, and I think you could make a pretty good argument, that it would be more humane if when people were captured in ongoing operations in the Horn of Africa and Pakistan and the Middle East, that it would be more humane if they went to Guantanamo at this point than if they went to some ramshackle security service, basement prison, where we don't really know where they go now. I mean, what do you think of that?
More humane? What do you mean?
I think it would be more humane to send people captured today to, or I suspect, I'm actually asking the question, would it be more humane?
Okay, well, let me ask you, what do you...
We established we don't know, there's a lot we don't know, but I'm establishing, would it be more humane that when people who are captured on the battlefield today, so to speak, Horn of Africa or in Pakistan or whatever, if they were sent to Guantanamo, as opposed to the Pakistani or Somali or Kenyan or Ethiopian or Iraqi or whatever facility where they go now when they're captured?
Okay, if you're asking would it be more humane in terms of basic
would their conditions be more humane,
facilities, in terms of conditions?
Prisoners of,
I mean, this has been sort of one of my grievances with Guantanamo coverage, because so often we've focused on the facility over the years. So, I write about this a little bit, that, for a while we would go on these camp tours that the kitchen was always part of the tour, and you'd inevitably get these stories that would be about all the calories the prisoners were eating and the food they were eating, and the facilities that they'd be living in, and the classes they were attending. So just to address that, in terms of there's different camps within Guantanamo, but the Camp 4, which is where the most, what they call, highly compliant detainees live, is better than most Canadian or American, or let alone any jails in Kenya or elsewhere. It's facilities. It's modeled after U.S. prisons. They're given allowed to live communally. There's classes. Yes, the facilities now are not what they were with those first shocking images when Guantanamo opened and there were the outdoor pens. It hasn't been like that for years. So there's always this sort of misconception. So if we're talking about basic humane facilities, sure, Camp 4 in Cuba is going to be a lot nicer than a cell in Ethiopia. But, we're talking sort of about the big question of law, and what does that mean then? That they're going to be charged, they're going to be charged before military commissions. We're not having trials at Guantanamo. So would it be more humane to hold someone indefinitely? I mean, I'm answering the question.
Well, I mean, I asked it as a question. What I'm saying is that currently the system is you capture someone in Pakistan, that you could go to a Pakistani facility. And, you know, if the system was you capture someone in Pakistan, he goes to an American facility, whether it's Guantanamo or Bagram or wherever.
Right.
I'm asking the question, would that, for 2011 going to 2012, be more humane than the current system?
What do you think?
And I'm just going to pose it as a question
Yeah.
because I don't know the answer yet. In fact, here's a tip to my bloghead viewers. This is something I've been working on for some time, and you'll see a big piece for Newsweek, at some point. So I'll just leave it at that. I pose that question because I find it. I find that this is like, it's an important kind of point to end it on, which is that you talk about the panic decisions after 9/11. I don't doubt at all that there were the way the decisions were made in the Bush administration. We know were unusual in a lot of ways. They felt that America had been sucker punched and was like the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. They were now at war. They had to totally rejigger their entire national security strategy and their priorities and everything they did. And and there were some decisions I think that were made that I believe that in their heart of hearts, I think that they would say that they regret. Did Obama similarly overreact to the initial overreaction? I leave it at that.
Well, this is why the book is called talks about the shades of gray, because as you know, I mean, we don't have the answers to all these questions, and I think the fact that even we're talking about this and debating it is a lot more than that was happening in the first few years after 9/11. And I think just the more information that comes out, the better decisions are going to be made. So I look forward to reading your piece.
Well, let's. I probably have said too much, but no. I mean, I want to let my journalism, my piece be prepared. But I wanted to raise it as a question because I thought it was relevant in the context of your reporting, particularly from Guantanamo and your experience in these countries. I mean, let me ask you: do you have any faith that a Yemeni jail would be better than, Guantanamo or Bagram at this point? I mean, I don't think there's any question, right? I mean,
yeah, I don't think the U.S. though wants to be the world's jailers either. I mean, I think that I think it's a huge question, and I think probably we could talk another hour about rule of law, the jurisdiction, international law, and all those issues which would come into it.
Yes, well, this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eli.
It's called Decade of Fear. If you have a Kindle or a Nook or a tablet device, can you download it on those devices?
You can, and you can still get it at bookstores too, good old-fashioned bookstores.
Yeah, if you want to be all 20th century about it, get it at a bookstore. I'm holding it up again here. Decade of Fear. Thanks so much, Michelle. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. It's been really good talking with you.
Good talking to you.
Bye.
All right. Bye.